My name is Elina Lehtomäki, and I would like to start and welcome you all to this conference. And then I would like to welcome especially our panel discussion today. We have 4 panelists now, and I have invited my dear colleagues, Professor Fazal Rizvi from Melbourne, and Professor Yusef Waghid from Stellenbosch, and Dr. Karen Pashby from Manchester Metropolitan, and Professor Thiago Gehre, Galvão from Brasilia. And I would not do more introductions, we agreed in the beginning, because you can see about and read about their work also on our website and find more information through their publications on their work. And what I would like us to do is to start with a discussion now with the panelists and use the time wisely. And I have given them a question to think about and to share their knowledge and wisdom with us on conceptualizations of global education and learning. And what I have asked them is to first briefly, 5 minutes each, to talk briefly about their views. How do they see conceptualizations? And I would like to welcome Professor Fazal Rizvi to start and tell us what does he think about the conceptualizations and their importance in research. We do all understand and share the view that yes, our conceptualizations guide our research, inform us, and also maybe reveal our approaches, even our sort of positions as researchers, how we see the world and how we see the phenomena we are studying. And I would like to ask Professor Fazal Rizvi, please, you may start and share your wisdom and your wise words with us. You're welcome.
I'm not sure about wisdom, but I have some views that I want to express. About 15 years ago, Thomas Friedman wrote an interesting book called The World Was Flat. He was much criticized because the world is not flat. World is uneven, world is unequal, and world is complex. We live in a world that is characterized by glowing levels of diversity. All communities are becoming more diverse. And when I go to Helsinki, I see that complexity. But on the one hand, there's complexity and diversity. On the other hand, we have ubiquitous conflict and contradictions. Diversity has become ubiquitous, but so have the tensions based on the fear of the other. Okay, there is growing awareness of emerging environmental crisis, but so has our appetite for consumption of goods of all kinds. We have witnessed growing levels of inequalities, both within and across nations, but so is our reluctance to share wealth and share resources. We have recognized that, sorry, there was something came up. We have recognized global interdependence, and we have mostly recognized that our destiny is bound up together. And yet, there is still the rise of ethno-nationalism that has become quite harmful. We are committed to democracy, or at least we say that we are committed to democracy, but we also have begun to like authoritarian leaders in the United States, in Brazil, in various other places. In other words, there's a deep tension between our love for democracy and our love for authoritarian leaders. We realize that there have been many benefits from global economy, but so is our distaste for the inequalities that it has produced. We are seduced by technological advancements, but also recognize the intrusive power of technology in our lives. In other words, there are contradictions galore. There's conflict everywhere. And indeed, global learning has to actually begin to come to terms with these contradictions and these conflicts. We cannot assume a flat world. We have to assume an uneven, difficult, complex, contradictory world. And then try to get people to understand where have these tensions, these contradictions come from, and how are they so persistent? And how is it that there are some political parties and political leaders are able to take advantage of it? In other words, we need to actually begin with the recognition that globalization is here to stay, but also the recognition that globalization is going to produce and is producing whole range of damaging outcomes and damaging effects. So that is where my premise in thinking about global learning begins. I argue that we need to actually develop ways of analyzing the contradictions as a way of moving towards any form of cosmopolitanism. In my view, cosmopolitanism is a positive thing, and yet it's understood in a whole range of ways. It can be seen as a political philosophy. It can be viewed as a moral order. It can be seen as a matter of cultural style. It can be seen in economic terms. So in other words, while the term cosmopolitanism has been all around the world in various civilizational traditions, you can find cosmopolitanism in not only in Western traditions, but also Chinese traditions, Indian traditions, Muslim traditions, and so on. In other words, we have been attracted to cosmopolitanism, but quite often as an abstraction. What I want to do is actually make cosmopolitanism as a form of learning. In other words, I want to actually develop those ideas that aspire to cosmopolitan without actually knowing what the teleology of cosmopolitanism is. In other words, what is the end of it? We recognize that the world has been produced by a whole range of inequalities that have continued to exist, from colonialism, from exploitation of various kinds, and from the continuing political inequalities and geopolitical problems. So I like to see cosmopolitanism as a mode of learning rather than as a mode of, as a generalized abstract principle. I want to begin with the ideas of these contradictions of the everyday and try to analyze the everyday in such a way as to develop a form of understanding of the world in which we are constantly struggling with the things that are the possibilities and things that are also the challenges. In other words, we want to look and situate ourselves in a world in which we recognize that tensions are not going to disappear anytime soon, but we nonetheless have a whole range of possibilities because the way in which the world is getting interconnected cannot also be denied. There is no turning back from globalization, and there is no turning back from automation and technology. How do we deal with those aspects and the fact that there is no turning back is really the fundamental question that I've been struggling with. And my view of cosmopolitan virtues of understanding these contradictions, is where I basically locate my understanding of global learning. To me, these values require criticality, they require imagination, they require empathy, they require historicity, and they require an understanding of our relationality, both pluses and minuses. In other words, we shouldn't begin with the assumption that a perfect world is possible. We should assume that contradictions will remain there, but nonetheless, we can have better than worse ways of dealing with these contradictions and these conflicts so that we can at least begin to teach students how to deal with the various contradictions that they invariably encounter. Contradictions are not going away. It's how we deal with those contradictions. That's where cosmopolitan virtues or cosmopolitan learning is most relevant and most useful in my view. I can say a little bit more later on, but I think I've used my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for the first points. And Professor Yusef Waghid, would you like to tell us your conceptualizations and your views related to global education and learning?
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conference, and I'm happy to share my views with you. I was brought up in the Anglo-Saxon philosophy of education in my home country. And so initially all my encounters with philosophy of education was through the vantage point of how the Anglo-Saxons thought about philosophy, education in relation to modern context. So to start off, I was brought up with Plato. So when Plato taught me that anything and everything about knowledge is should be seen in relation to justify true beliefs, I thought that was the absolute understanding of knowledge. And then when I encountered thinkers like Gilbert Ryle and Richard Rorty, I began to shift slightly away from knowledge as justified true belief to more to an understanding of knowledge in relation to justification. In other words, proffering reasons as to why you say knowledge is what it is. Until today, my understanding of knowledge is that knowledge is and ought to be localized. So I'm espousing a position of localized knowledge, and an example of that kind of knowledge I espouse in my works called Cosmo Ubuntu. So let me start off by making an argument for localized knowledge. So my point is that any understanding of knowledge can be seen in relation to Aristotelian concepts. And what I do is to develop a neo-Aristotelian view of these concepts. The one is that any understanding of knowledge should be seen in terms of poiesis, meaning that what makes something a concept, what makes something knowledge, is that it is underscored by what is in the presence of that concept or understanding. So poiesis, more as presence, makes a concept what it is. So knowledge is what it is because of poiesis, which is an Aristotelian idea. And then what I also draw on is that once you have an understanding of knowledge, that this conception of knowledge manifests in actions. And these actions can be practices, can be institutions, can be other structures. And this is what Aristotle would call praxis. So praxis would then be the manifestation of the notion or the idea of knowledge in various activities or actions. And this combination between poiesis and praxis is, to my knowledge, what constitutes an understanding of knowledge. So what I do is not to talk about knowledge per se as Gilbert Ryle would talk about propositional knowledge versus a procedural knowledge. In other words, knowledge about that something versus knowledge about how to implement that something. But what I talk about, or not even talking about objective knowledge as Rorty would talk about, and socially constructed knowledge, what I talk about is localized knowledge. Now, I'll tell you why I'm talking about localized knowledge. In the first instance, the very idea of praxis, which I translated very narrowly as action, that understanding of knowledge is related to producing things as humans, but producing them universally. In other words, what Derrida, an interpreter of Aristotle, would say, it's a gift of genus. In other words, what humans produce, the knowledge they produce, they do so universally. And that means that what holds them together as humans is that they give an account of why they say things are what they are. So in a way, human beings function as universal beings, meaning that their praxis or the actions that they embark on lead to a justification of knowledge whereby they hold one another accountable to what they believe in or what they hold to be true. So you can see it's a form of reconstructing Plato's ideas of knowledge as true and justifiable belief. And when humans hold one another accountable, they bring to that discourse what they are locally inclined to. In other words, their local understandings of knowledge, and this they bring into conversation with other understandings of knowledge to produce, you can call it reconstruct, what is called a globalized notion of knowledge. But the most important aspect of that form of globalized knowledge is that, to use two of my favorite theorists, the one is Derrida, is that that kind of knowledge has to produce an alterity, a change in understanding or the ways of doing things. So Derrida would argue for, if knowledge cannot produce freedom and justice, that would not count as knowledge. Or Agamben would argue, if knowledge does not help you to suspend and hold back and then to proffer, then that kind of knowledge would also be questionable. So he would talk about the rhythm of knowledge, whereas Derrida would talk about the alterity of knowledge. But these notions of alteration and rhythm are ways in which understandings of knowledge manifest in actions. So to sum up, my understanding and my allegiance to globalized knowledge, or you can call it a globalization of knowledge, is that first of all, knowledge is seen as universal because humans, wherever they are, give an account of their knowledges. So where they live, they bring into conversation with others their understandings of knowledge, which they either juxtapose or bring into conflict with existing understandings of knowledge to construct and reconstruct, even deconstruct, Derrida would argue, new understandings of knowledge. So there has to be an alteration of the other, as Derrida would argue. And as Agamben would argue, when you bring a particular understanding of knowledge into conversation with another understanding of knowledge, there must be moments of suspension, even dissent, and kind of holding back, or an advancement or proffering of a new idea. So for me, globalization of knowledge has something to do with context, but more to do with understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yusef Waghid, for your wise words. And now I would like to invite Dr. Karen Pashby from Manchester Metropolitan to share your views.
Kiitos, Elina. I've been engaging with the idea of global citizenship education. So that's what I'm going to be talking about for about a decade and a half. Interesting, Fazal, you linked to that Friedman piece. It's about the same time. I'm going to reflect back to consider my journey with conceptualizing GC and the importance and challenges of having so many different approaches under this sort of umbrella. And actually, that's why it's such an interesting area to research. So much is desired of this idea of global citizenship education, and so much is contested. And it's also why, similar to what Fazal was saying, I think it's actually very pedagogical. We're always learning and unlearning and challenging ourselves when we're engaged with this research. I argue that we need multiple approaches, but not multiple versions of the same approach. So in the next, hopefully now it's about 4 minutes and 50 seconds, I'm going to share a personal anecdote. I'm going to reflect a little bit on conceptualizing GC as theorizing from the pivot point. And then I'm going to try and articulate something I've been trying to work on, which is like an ethical commitment to this research and within this research. So I first heard the term global citizens when I was working as a foreign hired, privileged teacher at an international school in Campinas, Brazil. I was on a committee responsible for revising the school mission, which was to include developing global citizens. So many different conceptualizations and rationales came forward in that committee. Students being prepared for a successful future in the global economy, reflecting the different nationalities at the school and the importance of us all getting along as global citizens. And most significantly to me at the time, we started to have a discussion about the importance of our students working to reduce inequalities in Brazil and elsewhere. And it was really the first time I had heard such a rich discussion about the school's role in relation to inequalities. And I think that's when I started to get hooked on this concept of global citizenship education. Returning to Toronto for my graduate studies, I started tracing how this umbrella of different conceptualizations of global citizenship education was playing out at different levels. And at the time, I remember using Harriet Marshall's work in the UK, which she had identified two what seemed like competing agendas, a kind of economic, technicist or neoliberal one, and a more global social justice one. And she argued that they both relied on sort of shared assumptions about the role of the individual in a liberal democracy, which is A, why they coexist so easily, and B, why in some ways they weren't so different. And then Vanessa Andreotti's seminal piece about soft versus critical global citizenship education really challenged the edge of the debate and pushed it. Drawing on Spivak's notion of sanctioned ignorance, she challenged the field of GCE, and particularly in global north contexts, to consider how it reinforces the systems of exploitation it seeks to transform, and how global learning is implicated in persistent colonial relations of power. And building on this kind of engagement into my PhD research, I tried to develop this idea of theorizing from the pivot point to try and describe how I was embedded and complicit in the very system I was aiming to critique and change through this idea of global citizenship education. And it was my PhD supervisor, Reva Joshi, who started to help me come up with an analogy for this. She said, it's like playing basketball. When you get the ball, you're kind of stopped. You're stuck. You have to pivot around before you can make another move. It's a dynamic space. There's options of where to shoot the ball and to whom, but we also might end up passing the ball backwards or into a rehearsed play, one that's very easy and comfortable and may not actually change the dynamics of the game. In a recent meta review of 9 typologies of global citizenship education with colleagues, we found that there's over attention within our field of research to picking apart liberal humanist approaches and lining them up against neoliberal approaches, which can also be productive in some ways. Also, critical global citizenship educations identified in this literature more as an ideal that isn't evident in practice. However, my recent research with Louise Sund, with educators in the north of Europe, suggests actually critical approaches are quite evident in practice. And in that meta review paper, we weren't just critical of the liberal humanist and neoliberal approaches. We considered that critical approaches, including the ones I've been espousing, also pivot. We may be relying on familiar approaches as starting points to try and bridge and create sort of a scaffolding and to keep global citizenship education relevant. But does this enable or step over the more difficult questions about epistemological violence and ontological plurality and our own complicity within the systems we're trying to change? So beyond the basketball analogy, it's not a game. And this is where I think there's an ethical responsibility for those of us working with these concepts. We must be constantly reflexive and ready to accept when the approaches we're taking aren't working or end up reinforcing the exploitative relationships we're trying to address. This past week, seeing the mobilization of anti-racist protests around the world has reinforced that despite so many efforts in transformative learning and GCE, racism continues to be sanctioned. I think it's very easily, in my own work, I am noticing this, to unintentionally recenter whiteness or to step over race in this work. So one little thing that I've been working on recently is trying to engage more concretely with the concept of coloniality and global north context within this, and to work with a particular pivot point into what McNullo has referred to as Eurocentric critiques of Eurocentrism. And recently engaging with teachers in classrooms really been productive, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karen Pashby. And now what I would like to do is to ask the next speaker from Brasilia, Professor Thiago Gehre, for your views on conceptualizations in global education and learning. You're welcome.
Thank you, Elina. I will try to share my screen here. I have a presentation, if it's okay.
Yes, for 5 minutes, as I have allowed you each to talk. That's fine.
Okay, great.
Yes, so, we can see the slides as well.
So thank you so much for the invitation and to be here today to talk a little bit about the Brazilian experience. My discussion on conceptualization is going to bring a little bit about our research agenda on the SDGs and the 2030 agenda that we are doing here in Brazil. And it's very interesting because it's totally connected with all the speakers here today. Our idea is the main concept that we're trying to develop here is this idea of territorialization or design for territorialization, because the idea of how can you bring a global agenda to a different part of the world depends on the design that you are going to do that. So you have to reflect critically about that. So our concept, it's based on two assumptions. The first one is that we have to see and to acknowledge all the concrete experience of people that are dealing with this process of territorialization, both that from the beginning start to design the agenda, like all the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, to the people that are going to receive that in your country. So you have to try to understand all this process. And for that, you have to understand that you have a myriad of identities that connect the global with the local. And after that, you have to understand that this is a process of construction, that you need participation, you need to acknowledge all the levels of interactions, all the multiple dimensions of the local reality. So for that, we are going to try to understand this idea of territorialization. And for us, methodologically, it's a kind of discussion on cross readings. So you have to understand how people think in other parts of the world. That's huge in terms of global education. That's very important for us to try to understand like these connections between continents that you have. For example, in Brazil, in Africa are very connected, historically speaking. So this is this idea of a cross reading that you have to do based on different identities, culture, and try to understand this idea of norms localization. And for that, you need, of course, a dialogical approach. You have to understand what the society wants and what you can bring to the society. And this, of course, brings us to our social role of our universities in Brazil. Now is dealing a lot with this challenge of reproduction and reification of this idea of colonial systems of power. We deal with that a lot because the global north it's always give us this way of thinking, but we have now here in Brazil a huge discussion of all this context of racialization of politics in the world. It's happening in Brazil, of course, and for that you have to acknowledge there is a huge intersectionality between some subjects like race, gender, and sexualities, or sustainability and inclusion. We can't talk about as sustainability and development without inclusion, social inclusion in Brazil. And for that, I bring to try to understand the three level, the territorialization idea. We have to see that in a three level of analysis. The first one, of course, it's this necessity of governmental adaptation of what we have from the globe to the national level. In Brazil, you have the government a little bit now not worried about this idea that we have to ensure equity. And to ensure equity, it's to talk about gender, race, income, land, and other kinds of inequalities that we have in our country. So to do this kind of adaptation from the global level to the national level, we have to take in account this kind of equity and debate. So to talk about global education, that bring us some global notions on development, we have to be sure that we are going to talk about equity in all this kind of specificity that you have in Brazil, of course, in other part of the world. The second level of analysis, it's that one that is connected with societal, that we call societal transformation. Of course, the UN has his own way to deal with the accountability and to show the world what's going on. That's the global reports. You have the national reports, but we need the civil society engaged. Without the civil society, you don't have the proper answers for this kind of challenge that it's territorialize a global agenda. So we need reports and accountability instruments from the civil society. Here it's an example of our we call light report from civil society that show us how to connect research, outreach activities in the universities and our public policies. Our public policies are going to be better if we start a dialogue with all the research at the universities and with all our outreach activities. So you have two levels of kind of adaptation and transformation from the government and from the society. And of course, you need to bring us a third level of analysis that is a more personal change. If we're going to conceptualize territorialization on the realm of global education, you have to understand that we personally have to change. And I just bring to show you to everybody here. I received from a student in 2008 a book from our, I think the main reference on the pedagogical studies in Brazil, Paulo Freire, and she was talking to me as a student, Professor Thiago, because there is a subtle word where no one is able to enter only unarmed. That idea that as a professor, I had to change the way to see the world and to educate my students. That's huge. That's a personal transformation that everyone has to do. So when I'm talking to global education, we need the government to adapt global norms. We need the society to see what and check what the government is doing, but we have to change personally. There is a third level that is very important when you talk. And for that, then we bring us to our question, how to use the SDGs as a frame to change our reality. So we start to do a lot of pedagogical transformation inside the University of Brasilia. So there is a lot of cases that we are doing here in Brasilia to try to translate the SDGs and the 2030 agenda through education at the local level in Brazil. And this is a case that we are dealing here and using all the possibilities, including here on the right side, you can see that we are doing using clownery as a way, as a pedagogical tool to try to reach global things that people are discussing globally to the students in the poor part of Brasilia. Itapuã, it's a small city near Brasilia that's very vulnerable, very poor, a lot of inequalities here. This is the way that we are trying to approach this idea of territorialization, bring global education to our reality. I think that's it.
Thank you very much for your words, and I think from Professor Thiago from Brasilia, we get back.
I can't.
Yes, we have briefly talked about different topics and your conceptualization views and perspectives. And I think we have heard about globalized knowledge from Professor Yusef Waghid. And then we heard from Professor Fazal Rizvi about the importance of cosmopolitan virtues. And then from Dr. Karen Pashby, we heard about conceptual and theoretical traps and ethical implications, how research related to global education learning is also an ethical issue. And we heard about the transformative approaches in education. Pedagogical changes was the latest that we heard also from Professor Thiago, and how we have these different levels that we can influence. And we, I think, are privileged in that way because we are in academia and we can voice and also brief our researchers and colleagues and students. I would like to ask you, how do these things connect together? How do we encompass all this?
And who are you asking?
Yes, I would like to ask you all. And maybe we start from globalized knowledge. Professor Yusef, how do you see these things connect together in your view?
I can see a connection in terms of the understanding of knowledge I espoused this morning. The connection to me is, once you have a particular understanding of knowledge or education or learning or teaching, then that particular idea would invariably manifest somewhere in a practice, within yourself, in relation with others. So they fit together because of the understanding that humans interrelate. Humans are engaged in encounters, what I would call education. So the encounters that they engage with allow them to make sense of one another's claims, to make meanings, to offer dissent, to show agreement. And when they do make sense of one another's claims, these sense-making or meaning-making, I would say, manifest in the actions they pursue or embark on. And that's usually associated with the institutions and society in which they live. So I can see the connection, and for me the connection in our expositions relate to the idea of education as an encounter. You encounter what you have in relation to others, and together, it's a collectivity, you make meaning of these ideas for the advancement of society. And if I just look at the latter, Thiago's presentation, it was about the empowerment of society, it's about the improvement, which is quite in line with a Freirean notion of liberation. But that can only happen when we have particular understandings of education and of knowledge that seem to be underscored by an emancipatory politics.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And Professor Fazal, would you like to continue from here?
I think I would actually. It's very interesting actually. I had not realized that Yusef and I have very similar disciplinary background. I did my PhD in analytical Anglo-Saxon philosophy as well at the University of Manchester, as it happens, Karen, before going on to do my PhD at the University of London on Wittgenstein. And I actually really enjoyed what Yusef said. I think the rhythm of knowing is a very important concept. You know, in other words, we mustn't actually work with concept of knowledge that is static. Knowing as a verb is a much more interesting phenomena than knowledge as an end product, as propositional or indeed procedural, either way. In other words, we are a constant state of knowing and constant state of making knowing, if you like. And that's where the term rhythm of knowledge and rhythm of knowing, if you like, in my view, is much more attractive to me. But let me actually say something about the notion of encounters. My own view is that notion of encounter is incredibly important and is not analyzed to the extent that it should be. Many years ago, I think it was in 1991, Mary Lou Pratt, a Stanford anthropologist, wrote a very interesting book called Contact Zone. And she tried to problematize the notion of contact, in other words, encounters. But I have thought much about encounters. Encounters past produce the present. There are encounters now, and there are encounters that we aspire to. In other words, there are three kinds of encounters that we should be thinking about at any given time. Colonialism was a set of encounters that have produced our now, which actually has given us our language, our knowing practices, which need to be problematized as a way of understanding the encounters now. So there is a relationship. There is an encounter between the encounter past and encounter present, if you know what I mean. And then I think there is also what kind of encounters do we envisage that might be otherwise than they are now? In other words, how can we relate to each other in ways that has been produced for us through the history of colonialisms of various kinds and history of modernity as well, which is another form of colonialism, as Vanessa Vanderotti points out, has many over and over again. You know, and as a result, our concepts of encounter often romanticize knowing each other without understanding encounters as a historical product, a product of uncomfortable and very difficult histories, and how our present is affected by those histories, so that when we think about local, then local is not entirely a local, unmediated by the colonial past, the colonial encounters. And I think unless we start historicizing our encounters, then encounters has every possibility of becoming a romantic, new liberal notion, or the kind of soft citizenship that Karen talked about. You know what I mean? So if you want to have critical citizenship, then we must actually not simply assume encounters as being necessarily a good thing, but actually realize that the past encounters were really painful, harsh, violent, not very nice to large populations of large groups of people, etc., etc., and that they have not entirely disappeared, that the legacy of those encounters continues. So I think we should do a little more work on the notion of encounters, past, encounters present, and encounters futures, as a way of understanding how we make the rhythm of knowledge, which Agamben has pointed out, and which Yusef so clearly articulated in his own notion of glow-local. You know, so glow-local is historically produced. It's not entirely thus defined by particular locality. It's defined by relations that had existed in the past. So I think I might actually finish off there. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Would you like to add, Karen, on this?
Well, Fazal just both of you just did a wonderful job. I guess I would just maybe highlight that I sort of saw across our presentations or inputs, like the notion of productive tensions. So what tensions can do for us pedagogically. And because so much of this work, and I can only speak to the work I've been doing in mostly quite global North context like Canada and the UK, Finland, and Sweden recently, we have had a tradition inherited through a lot of really important work, say through human rights education and others, where we wanted to solve problems for people. That was the ultimate goal, was to use global learning so we can, solve these problems that we're so stressed out about and concerned about, and that are very real in like very material ways. And so I think really what we've seen in the last little while is a shifting away from that kind of solving other people's problems to a much more need for a much more reflexive approach, where yes, we ought to continue to think of ideas to work together, but that we don't assume that we have everything we need to know to solve these problems. And I thought that was really interesting, Fazal, that your notion of cosmopolitanism as a source of learning, or as a mode of learning, is really engaged in tensions. And I think we can link that up, Yusef, to, really thinking carefully about knowledge and what that means and how it's localized and how it works in different concepts. And then Thiago, I related quite strongly with the way that in your context, you've been able to use the SDGs as a kind of site of tension, right? Because we know that they're embedded in lots of the processes that have contributed to the ongoing issues that we have. And yet they're also this space to raise tensions, to mobilize actions. So yeah, that was what I was thinking across the four, I guess, including mine.
Yes, thank you. And Thiago, what would you like to continue from here, bringing these things together that we have been talking about?
Yeah, very interesting questions and sayings. That there is something that is interesting about the learning process, that we have to take in account that we have, of course, different rhythms and velocities in the learning process, and that for me it's quite important in this society that we live today, because it repositioning the place of and the functionality and the relevance of the professor or the teacher. So with all the technology that we have, we need a teacher, we need a professor, because I think there is a special place of this position in the society of information, that's to deal with the rhythms and the different velocities of learning, and that's totally connected with this idea of the localized knowledge, and the way how we brought for different realities global conceptions of development or sustainability, etc., etc. So this learning process of rhythms and velocities in the place of the educators, I think that's interesting. The idea of encounters that they are discussing now brings me this reflection that we have to kind of a self-reflection on our encounters with our inspiration, because of course Paulo Freire is our I think the more important inspiration for us that talk about education. But now in Brazil we are realizing that we need to reenact or to reconnect with other inspiration base and intellectuals. Like we need to understand that we have a huge kind of a base of like Black intellectuals, women intellectuals that are very strong in Brasilia tradition of thinking, that we are not using and discussing and having as a way to deal with the discussions that we have now in Brazil. So we need this re-encounter with this kind of base of knowledge, and of course the social role of the public university. In Brazil, of course, you have this specificity that maybe we have in other parts of the world, but our universities, most of them are public, and they have a social role, and this role is, of course, to produce science that it's on the verge of disappear, in that in this negationism, and I don't know, that it come from United States and Brazil too, this idea that science is not reliable. So I think this a strong thing that we have to talk about the social role of the university, and of course to produce and to form, to educate a new generation of people on concepts that are very strong: decency, dignity, diversity. So this is the social role of the university that we have to highlight now, I think.
Thank you very much for your connections now, because I think these are essential when we are co-constructing new wisdom or knowledge, and I think these are very important points. I would like us now come back to some of the conceptualizations in order to build this sort of richness of knowledge as well, and bring in different knowledges. And you mentioned, I think, Thiago, and I think you others also referred to myriad of identities. And we are now having this early career researchers conference here, hosted by the University of Oulu in collaboration with the Academic Network of Global Education and Learning and Global Education Network Europe, and with the University Graduate School. And we are to educate the next generations, or collaborate and co-create new knowledge. How do you see that we do it best? If you very briefly, maybe 1 minute per person, tell the final wise words. What would you encourage? How would you encourage young researchers to approach and rethink their conceptualizations in their research? Just very briefly, please. And shall we start from Fazal?
Okay. Well, my own view is that we are going through a very, very, very tough historical era. Okay, this era is going to actually give rise to tensions and problems that are much more intense than they were when I was early career researcher around 40 years ago. Okay, in that period we had difficulties, but I think there was a great deal that was kind of agreed to, not only in relation to facts, but also in relation to values. Those things have gone as a result of a whole range of political conflicts of various kinds, including identity politics, I might add. So I think what we are doing now is working in an era in which things are incredibly unsettled, which actually means that it is difficult to do research in an unsettled space, but it's also an opportunity because it allows us to imagine concepts and generalize concepts and possibilities in a completely fresh ways. Never before have we needed imagination about what could be, how things could be otherwise than they have been, than now, as a result of the three crises that we are facing at the moment: the political crisis, the health crisis, and the economic crisis. All of them have actually led to a very difficult set of circumstances in which the research requires us to think that we cannot return in some technological fashion to things that have already happened, but to imagine things in new ways. In other words, one of the most important topics to study might actually be possibilities, how things might be otherwise, okay? Both in terms of pedagogy, both in terms of organizations, international organizations, and indeed things like ethnocentricity. How can we problematize ethnocentricity, ethnocentricity of ethnocentricity of ethnocentricity? Regress there. You know, those are the kind of possibilities that we have now. The settled definitions are no longer helpful to us. So the role of imagination is incredibly important, and the role of studying things that are not only empirical and normative, but also speculative becomes really important in our current circumstances.
Thank you. And Karen or Thiago, who would like to start and have 2 minutes or one with the final last advice for early career researchers?
I'm assuming the gesture meant for me to go ahead there, Thiago. Obrigada. Yeah, I think, you know, I started talking about the umbrella of GC, which is, I mean, lots of us have used that term, but there's a really nice piece by Shalene Jorgensen and Lynette Schultz on that in the context of higher education. But, you know, people might have seen my talks before where I actually put the umbrella up there, and then like the picture of an umbrella, which I really relate to living in Manchester, that's like on the ground being trampled over by people. So the fact is, it's so difficult sometimes to research in this area because something like global learning and global citizenship education can kind of mean everything and nothing. So as researchers, my advice to you would be to take the time to look at the types of debates that have been occurring, because it's what I find the most exciting thing about this community is that it invites debate, invites critical discussion, and certainly within the Angel Network, it's a really community space to do so. What's really easy to happen is because so many people have done excellent typologies and frameworks, it's really easy to just pick up one of those and apply it to your research. And I would invite you to really look at those frameworks or typologies or whatever types of thing you're using, whether it's soft versus critical or that really interesting typology that Lynette Schultz or somebody else has come up with. Oxley Morris have a really detailed one, for example, and really think about why it's useful or not for your context. We have been having a lot of debates in this field, and it's really, I think, worth taking some time to map that out for yourself and where you position yourself. Because what I guess I'm saying, what we were trying to say in that article where we map some of these is that we're tending to kind of focus on nitpicking within similar areas. And I really want to encourage you to push the edge of the debate. Once you've looked at what debates are out there, speak back to us, speak back to those of us who've been writing in this and push those debates. And that's what the research can do. And if you look at the debates that have been occurring over the last 15 years, you'll see that that's been happening in some of our most exciting pedagogy and policy work and theoretical work is coming out of there. Finally, I would just say, remember that your slice of the conversation is really important. So take the time to specify it and again, push back and speak back to the theory that's there. How is it useful? How isn't it useful? And what can you contribute from looking at your particular problem space in your community that you're examining and working with? Thanks.
Thank you. And Thiago.
Yes, thank you. I would just like to emphasize this idea that it's come from the latest, I think, writings of Paulo Freire. That's this idea of a pedagogy of indignation. I think the context that we are living in today around the world, and of course in Brazil, bring us that this necessary engagement with indignation against all those kinds of excess violence, structural violence, in a state that it's hyper vigilant and against the civil rights. So we need to use education as a tool to transform. to transform for the better. And I encourage people and all the professors and the teachers around the world to use education as a tool to bring more peace and, of course, more stability and more happiness for their realities. I think that's it.
Thank you. And Yusef, would you like to say the wise words to the end? Sorry. Yes.
My own thinking along notions of education, learning, teaching, and knowledge has been to situate myself momentarily within a space of rupturing, I call it. So it's again a word I've borrowed from the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, when he talks about rupturing moments. And I think the word rupturing brings to mind important facets of doing things. And for me, there are two ways of looking at rupturing. The one way is when I rupture education or knowledge or understandings or ideas, then I bring to that moment my own understandings of which I am reflexive about. In other words, I do not enter this moment of rupturing with preconceived ideas in a monolithic way as if nothing can change. I have to rupture myself so that I would be persuaded by dissonance and dissent. I would be persuaded by that which comes to me from what is seemingly otherwise. So that means that really when I do my own work, when I do my research, then I must open myself up to moments of rupturing. But the other side of the story is when I pursue my own rupturing, I also become open to that which is not yet. And I use the famous words of the American philosopher, curriculum theorist Maxine Greene. So if I'm not yet, it means that I remain, to use Giorgio Agamben's words, that I remain in potentiality as a human, as a person, as a researcher. And to remain in potentiality means that I'm open to things anew, Hannah Arendt. I'm opening myself up to new reimaginings, as Maxine Greene would argue, and as Fazal would agree with. I open myself up to things that are otherwise. But I also open myself up to what Agamben calls, Giorgio Agamben refers to as new becomings. Now that combination of opening yourself up to new becomings and being reflexively open to things about yourself, that combination, I think, is very empowering in embarking on moments of rupturing that can enhance this new pedagogical approach to looking at things differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you.